So this really goes back to an ideological clash where you have a way of doing things, and if someone doesn't do things that way, you're intolerant of them. Interestingly, that's what Muslims are always accused of. We're accused of having a way of doing things, having a way of believing, having a system that we believe to come from God, and it's true, we do have all those things. But then we're accused of saying that if someone disagrees with us, we would kill them, and we would keep them as second-class citizens, and we would not take care of their needs. And examples are given from things that is how ISIS is doing in Iraq or something like that. So how would you respond to that? How would Muslims have treated say the Uthmani Khilafah had extended contact with the indigenous people? How would things have been different? Wouldn't we have done the same thing?
The answer is obviously no, and actually based on the work of Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick, what he based on his research and studies that he's done is actually the Muslims actually reached out and were actually trading with the natives before. So there was Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Idrisi, who worked for King Roger II in Sicily. And so basically, when they went, what Abdullah King Quick kind of presents from his research is that when they went there and they had to speak to the natives, they actually spoke to them in Arabic.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So what that means is that what he surmises from that is that because they were able to speak Arabic, that means Arabic was an entrenched part of that culture, right? Like that means that the Muslims stayed there, they landed there to teach someone their language, right?
Sure.
It's not something that's going to happen on a transactional basis,
sure.
Right?
So they at least had someone who knew how to speak the language, even if for commerce purposes or whatever. It shows there was a relationship.
Absolutely. So the fact that they were able to speak Arabic, and it shows that Muslims had sustained contact, and that this type of predatory relationship is even with the natives themselves wasn't there. However, I mean, when I'm asked this question about natives and like this, when I'm asked this question about how Muslims are treated and how we treat others when it comes to when the Muslim armies come into a country, I mean, the first evidence I give is myself. Right? Like, why am I Muslim, right? When you look at, for example, if Muslims came into our lands, obviously,
India.
Obviously our ancestors weren't Muslims, Islam was spread to us.
Yeah.
Right? If they came in and made us stand in pyramids, naked pyramids, like the way we saw with what the Americans did in Abu Ghraib, obviously that civilization is not going to accept that belief system, right? Right? And that's the point, is that when the Muslims come in, Islam has a framework that is capable of working with the local population, and the bigger point is, when we look at this, is that all civilizations, whether it's Islam, communism, or capitalism, all have to deal with believers and disbelievers, right? So, for example, there are going to be people who believe in Islam and people who disbelieve in Islam. That's not controversial. Yeah. But what people don't realize is that there's going to be people who believe in capitalism and disbelieve in capitalism, right? So the question is, how does that civilization deal with disbelievers, right?
I think there's an interesting point here, though, because most people don't actually recognize capitalism to be a belief system. People don't, they see it as a way of just doing things, and that's just how it is, and that's what it means to be technological and industrial. You have to be capitalist. They don't see capitalism as a set of assumptions about life that you believe in. It's a way of life. It's a religion almost. And so to question, to say someone disbelieves in capitalism, people don't really understand what you're talking about. They don't see it the same as being, tolerant or intolerant towards someone who believes or disbelieves in Islam, for example. But as you're pointing out, it is the same. If someone disbelieves in capitalism and they're killed for it, like the indigenous were, that's an apostasy law, essentially.
Absolutely, and that's one of the difficulties that they had with the natives. The natives had this concept of common ownership, and they had different concepts of how to own property, right? And this is obviously one of the biggest clash, even with the communists in America, when they didn't believe in private property, right? So this is like their pillar of the iman of belief of the capitalist systems. You have to believe in private property, and those who are able to create movements and things like that are brutally repressed, right? So that's what we saw that last time. We saw this kind of a level of wave of repression was obviously with Occupy Wall Street. they had about 8,000 arrests. So some people think that Occupy just kind of, people got bored and went home. No, the movement was actually physically repressed, and you can check the Huffington Post. They had an article was about 7,000 to 8,000 people were arrested and that type of thing, and you can see the similar kind of thing happening here with Standing Rock, right? With
absolutely,
sort of when they're incarcerated, they're strip searched and they're humiliated and things like that. So it's not just the reality of the prison system here and these jails and things like that. It's a form of repression. It's not just walk in the park, right?
Sure.
So I think that when we look at Islam from that perspective of how it deals with people who do not believe in a system, I think that one of the important things of what when we look at how a non-Muslim person lives in the Islamic State in the Caliphate or the Khilafah, is that though they openly disbelieve in the state's constitution, they're still given full citizenship, right? And just to give you an idea, I think there was a good quote from Imam Karfi, which I have here, may Allah have mercy on him, and he summarizes the responsibilities towards the non-Muslims, which is known as Ahl Dhimma, or the people of the covenant, as follows: it is the responsibility of Muslims to the people of the Dhimma to care for their weak, fulfill the needs of their poor, feed the hungry, provide clothes, address them politely, and tolerate their harm, even if it was from a neighbor, even though the Muslim would have an upper hand. The Muslims must also advise them sincerely on their affairs and protect them against anyone who tries to hurt them or their family, steals their wealth, or violates their rights.
And this is the definition of a relationship between, people who have read a few things on the internet about Islam. They use this word dhimmis, and they think it's some kind of like synonymous with dummies or something, and we think dhimmis are these kind of like substandard citizens. But this is how an Islamic scholar is actually identifying the relationship that we're supposed to have with and this isn't some kind of new age scholar. This is a classical Islamic scholarship.
Absolutely, yeah,
centuries old, right?
It's not someone's trying to try to fit Islam into capitalism just to please the the White House.
Sure.
It's and I think that's the important point. Again, the point is how does the civilization deal with disbelievers, right? Like, and this is how Islam deals with disbelievers. Whereas we see whether it's the natives here, how they're being dealt with, or whether it's the Muslims in Iraq, how they're being dealt with when it was like Abu Ghraib or the torture or whatever it's going on, or in Syria, right? And that's the key difference.
But like historically speaking, I mean, Muslims have ruled over Egypt, Greece, India, a little bit of Southern Europe. Do we see any evidence or any remnants of there being good treatment of these minority communities that were not Muslim but were still ethnic minorities that were indigenous to a land?
What I tell people when they ask this type of question, what I say is that the Greeks were as native to the Ottomans as the Ojibwe or the Iroquois were to the British, right? And sometimes it's hard for us to do that because we live in an era where the European race has ruled, and it's hard for us to imagine them as natives, right?
Yeah.
But the Greeks were natives, right? Like, they were the natives and the Ottomans invaded. There's no difference in the sense like of that invasion versus the invasion of like in terms of what happened.
Sure.
To like how the Europeans invaded here. However, I know Greek food. I can name a few dishes like off the top, souvlaki or something like that,
Sure.
right?
Gyros.
Yeah, I can go access Greek culture on the Danforth in Toronto, right? I have no idea where to get native food. Like, I have no idea what natives eat other than what maybe I learned in grade 5 in school here.
Sure.
Right. I don't know anything about native culture. Right. And I'm born here. I grew up here, and I'm from here, and I don't know. Right. I know more about Greek culture than I do about native culture. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's not a historical evidence, an archaeological evidence. Right. Like, you can go to Greece and you can study the Greek language. You can see Greek people. It's still to this day. They're just talking about building their first masjid in Greece, right?
Yeah.
It hasn't been built like that. That's how much the culture, though. I mean, obviously it's not a good thing that Muslims aren't allowed to pray there in the masjid, but it just shows you that how their culture and how intact they were, that they were able to that their culture is there and we can access it till today.
Ottomans ruled over Greece completely for like how many centuries?
It was at least 200 years. Right?
At least 200 years, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, kind of similar to how long indigenous people have been ruled over by the capitalist Americans.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And interestingly, I mean, so you're saying that if you look at the well-being of the Greeks, that shows you something about how the Ottomans, who were in power over them, how Muslims treated indigenous minorities, as opposed to looking at the state of the indigenous people, where language is an issue because it's being destroyed and was forcibly destroyed for a long time. You talk to a lot of indigenous kids that went to, well, now they're not kids anymore, indigenous elders that went to residential school as kids. Their native languages were beaten out of them. They were forced to speak English so they wouldn't, keep their savage culture, quote unquote. And other things like that. I think in Canada it was called like the Gradual Civilization Act, and trying to take children to residential schools and destroy their ideology, essentially. What I find interesting about this, though, is, I mean, really, if we boil it down, look at Muslims and how we're, I mean, look at the primary fault line of Muslims that are being treated, in a certain way all across the world, into how indigenous people are being treated, how Latin America has been treated, and how the capitalist elite have basically treat the world. Wherever you have resistance to capitalism, you have the worst form of treatment. Whether it be the indigenous people that had their own way of doing things, whether it be the entirety of the... I mean, they always ask, why are Muslims so angry? Why are Muslims so violent? Why are Muslims the ones whose names always come up whenever one of these attacks happens? That's not true. I mean, no one knows about the Muslims that are being massacred in Central African Republic or in Myanmar or any of those places because the media just doesn't pick up on it.
Absolutely.
Or, even Sri Lanka at this point, you know what I mean? There's Buddhist extremists all over the place, apparently. But on a separate point, Islam is specifically being targeted, and Muslims are specifically being targeted and their way of life being destroyed because it resists capitalist notions. It was similar to what happened with, Latin America because there was the fear of it going totally communist. Mm. And that's why they used military intervention and propped up dictators all over Latin America. They've done the same with the Muslim world. And so really this clash and this struggle is ideological, and most people just aren't willing to understand or appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's partly the the dominance of capitalism. It hides these types of things, and I think that's what you said earlier with that people fail to recognize capitalism as a belief system, right? And they don't see, that it has these kind of policies and things like that. Like you said, like about apostasy, like people don't realize that. Like for example, like the Black Panthers when they were executed, right, by the police, right, like Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. For practicing their Second Amendment rights of open carry, right? Yeah, and they were communists as well, right? So they they were apostates from the capitalist perspective, and they got a bullet in the back of their head, right? Yeah. So it's like it's at and this is like the point. We, as Muslims, when we look at these issues, it's important for us to kind of step back and take a look at the sort of the big picture, and say okay, Islam deals with this. Well, how do you deal with that, right? And not just take the criticism, not just take that criticism at face value, but kind of think about it and say, hey, wait a minute, well, what about these things, right? So
it's about challenging and having a real conversation as opposed to just going into apology mode.
Right, and it's about how do we live together as human beings. Like Islam has solutions, right? But it's also that capitalism, this is how it's dealing with the problem. Let's not just repeat blindly what the media says, right?
Yeah.
Let's look at and say, okay, well, how do we live with it? Okay, well, what do you think about this system? Would you, how do we as Muslims fit under this system? How do natives fit under this system? And how do the Greeks and so on fit under this system, right, of Islam, right?
And I think as a point of conclusion, I mean, really for Muslims, conversations like this aren't about blame, and they're not about creating demons or have a black-white approach towards who's a friend, who's an enemy, or anything like that. It's more about building bridges and when being able to work with other people because you have actual concepts that you're carrying to them. So if I'm speaking to an indigenous, activist, we have something to talk about. I can talk about my experience as a Muslim as opposed to their experience as an indigenous person. As a quick anecdote to end on, I had an indigenous studies professor who was excellent, one of the best in McMaster, honestly. And he'd given, I was writing a paper on indigenous sovereignty for him. I did the whole paper, wrote it all out, and I just wanted to just help with the thesis a little. And as I was making conversation in his office, I said something like, Muslims, we also come from a tradition where we're always, we're always made to seem like it's out of date, and no one should listen to us anymore, and we should just do things the way capitalists want to, and we're made to feel bad for having our own way of doing things. And his first response, and a lot of Muslims will understand what he said. He said, "Oh, so I guess you don't like Tariq Fatah then." He'd never had a conversation on Islam. He understood Tariq Fatah to be, someone who was, let's say, a bit of an Uncle Tom for Muslims. And he immediately connected on that, and he started talking, "Oh, don't worry about it. Yeah, we have indigenous people like that too." We connected on something that you would be seen as a purely Islamic problem. Most other non-Muslims I've spoken to don't understand why Muslims have an issue with Tariq Fatah. Yeah. He got it instantly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's a way of building connections, I think. And really, as Muslims, I think, if we can learn anything from places like places of activism like the Dakota, the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, is we need to make more connections. We need to go further and try to talk to more people about where we come from and try to find where they're coming from and find ways to work together. So Jazakallah khair for listening, and Assalamu alaikum.